I do want to watch the minimum wage one, so let's get that one started.
The right minimum wage, $0.00. That was the headline of an editorial in one of America's most prestigious newspapers. Can you guess which one? The Wall Street Journal, perhaps. Right city, wrong paper. This editorial appeared in the New York Times in 1987. There's a virtual consensus among economists, the Times wrote, that the minimum wage is an idea whose time has passed. So economists in the liberal paper were on the same page, pun intended. Why? Because they understood that a minimum wage does not guarantee jobs. It guarantees only that those who get jobs will be paid at least that minimum. And that leads to two bad outcomes: unemployment and higher prices. I can best explain this by asking a simple question. What is a wage? A wage is the price of labor. Now, what happens if the price of labor rises not because workers have become more productive, not because a business must pay higher wages to hold on to valuable employees, but only because the government requires it? When the minimum wage rises, employers will adjust. They will use less labor. They'll fire current employees or cut back on their hours. They will also raise prices for their goods or services. These are undesirable consequences. But let's also consider another bad effect. Businesses will hire fewer workers, especially those with little or no job experience. Suppose you're young and haven't worked many jobs before. Maybe you've never had a job and are trying to land your first one. The work you can offer an employer may be worth only, say, $7 an hour. You agree?
Yes.
He agrees?
Yes.
And you have your first job. But what if the minimum wage set by the government is higher than $7? What if it's $10 or more? Well, you won't get the job. You may be willing to work for $7 an hour, but under minimum wage laws, it would be illegal for you to do so. This very point was made by Paul Samuelson, one of the leading economists of the 20th century and a prominent liberal. I paraphrase from his classic textbook, Economics. What good does it do a black youth to know that an employer must pay him a minimum wage if the fact that he must be paid that wage keeps him from getting a job?
All right, we're not done with the video, but I did just want to pause on that point for two reasons. We've also got
it's a question. We want to know the answers to it.
Yeah, so that is a question, of course, but also I do just. All right, I have one substantive thing to say, but before we do that, I do just say Prager U kind of bitched out on this one because I think we know why he said, I paraphrase. Like, they had quotation marks, right? So they were giving you a full quote, but they started by saying, I paraphrased. And it's like, I don't think he said black.
Yeah. I mean, it's also worth noting that they had to go all the way back to 1987 to find a single op-ed in a centrist paper that kind of sort of endorsed their view. I mean, that's a good long fucking time ago. I mean, The Simpsons wasn't even on there, for God's sake.
It's true. That was just barely before the first shorts of the Tracy Ullman show.
I mean, that's how anthropologists dictate time in the modern era is before Simpsons and after Simpsons.
I mean, is that not the way that you think about the world? I mean, that's the fucking typology I break things down with.
Yeah, the Crusades and the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza and the French Revolution were all in the pre-Simpsons era.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I will say I did miss watching these fucking Prager U videos, though, because those cartoons that they include in them are pretty bonkers, but they're a lot of fun. Like, say whatever you will about them, but if you smoked a joint and you were watching that, you probably think, like, this is some good shit.
Yeah, well, especially the one with the ghost of Stalin.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, actually, that one might make you think that you got to cut down. Like, it's too much. This is unpleasant, but
definitely, yeah. From like an aesthetic perspective, this is like a minor contribution to like the Prager U canon. Like, the major works are obviously all the Prager U for kids stuff. Some of the stuff about defending the British Empire, that's all like major contributions as well, right? But people have an off day, and this one just happens to be a bit more boring. But you can't hold them like that against them.
Yeah, fair enough. I also just, the more substantive thing I want to say before we go on is that you have that argument that he was giving. So before he sort of pivoted to unemployment, or like unemployment is kind of the argument the whole time, but like the initial way of framing the argument was, well, look, if you agree, right, the employer offers you the job with these conditions and you agree, the employer says yes, you say yes, government says no. Like, just portraying that as being terrible in itself, it's maybe worth pointing out. This would apply to a lot of other stuff besides minimum wage laws.
Yeah, and I want to point out, there's a lot that's been written about this, and it's absolutely true that in 1987, during the heyday of the neoliberal Reagan era, it was a consensus among academic economists that raising minimum wages would deplete access to jobs for low-income and low-skilled workers. But all this was based upon certain presumptions about what was going to happen, not backed by any kind of firm empirical research. Since then, and it's been about 30, 40 years, there's been a huge amount of studies that have done of actual cases where people either don't raise the minimum wage or they do raise the minimum wage, and almost uniformly the economics profession, things have shifted quite a lot, right? Where people now will say that there are some areas where there can be a temporary depreciation in the number of people that are hired because of minimum wage increases. But that's temporary, right? The usual expectation is that we'll actually create jobs in the long run because it will obviously boost consumer spending. And in fact, in 2019, there were a bunch of economists who analyzed, I think it was like 138 different examples of minimum wage increases in the US. And they found that none of them were associated with significant job losses. And in fact, in many cases, there were actually job increases, right? So that's good empirical research in the real world, as opposed to these kind of abstract, woolly economic modeling. And it's telling, again, that he had to go all the way back to 1987 to find one person who would reinforce his worldview, right? Because that really kind of dates his understanding of the profession as a whole.
Also, the hell world he describes about like people not having jobs and like the not having enough requirements and all that stuff. That sounds exactly like what's going on right now. I mean, has Homeboy tried to get a minimum wage job these days?
Yeah. So I mean, there have been a ton of studies on this, and I should say, to be fair, not all of them point in the same direction. There's the different a priori models are going to get different results. I mean, what Matt's described it as kind of a Keynesian demand side assumption about how that's going to work, and there are obviously the sort of more neoclassical like Econ 101 textbook assumption would be different. But there are lots of studies. Some of them show unemployment effects. Some of them don't. Some of them maybe show the positive employment effects. Generally speaking, meta studies where you crunch together the numbers from a bunch of different studies don't really show any significant increase in unemployment over time. There's anybody who wants to take a good hour on this. There's a useful, it is several years old at this point, but there's a useful rundown of a lot of this research for the Center for Economic Policy Research called Why Does the Minimum Wage Have No Discernible Effect on Unemployment? And if nothing else, it gives you a crash course in the last few decades of this research. It's one of the most heavily studied, to the extent that economists actually go out there and act like a social science and study things empirically. This is one of the most studied things in the field. But if there were a conservative or libertarian here, I know what they would say. I know that they would, or at least one who'd done their homework, right? What they would say is no. But you're talking about, Kruger and whatever, this had X, Y, and Z methodological flaws. So I don't think they were looking at quite the right thing. And, they'd people who are obsessives about this, will be able to tell stories like this about all sorts of studies they don't like, even though it's very hard to get a meta study that says that there are clear, big unemployment increases. that's not just blatantly like, I'm going to cherry pick a few that I like, you know, and crunch together the numbers for those. But like, I always think like, okay, one, even if there were some increased unemployment, then how much are we talking about? Right. Cause like, and you know, I'd also know people who support a higher minimum wage typically support, you know, like enhanced social safety nets to make lose your job not as bad. And also, especially right now, I mean, you know, we are like, you know, a third of Pakistan was very recently underwater because we're facing this global climate catastrophe. I think if we actually got serious about a green energy transition, I think we would actually probably need more people to do that than you know, than there are unemployed people right now. And I could certainly think of other things that a public sector jobs program could do to pick up that slack, right? So at that point, I think that really usefully is like, okay, do you actually care? Like, is your priority actually those, you know, whatever, the young Negro youth or whatever that they didn't, you know, they weren't willing to read the actual quote. Do you actually care about them, or do you care about, or do you really care about the business owners, right? Who you think are going to, you know, certainly have lower profits, and for smaller ones, you know, maybe go under because of this, you know. And it's like, then we can have an honest debate about that, right? If it's not, you know, because if you'd be opposed to the combination of a higher minimum wage and also massive public jobs programs, then that's not it, right? You know, then that's you know, then it can't be the unemployment that's really driving you. You know, never mind the idea that, you know, even without the public jobs programs, that if anybody loses their jobs, they do sort of address this later in the video, that if anybody loses their jobs, that therefore, you know, it's like a net loss for the working poor, is crazy reasoning anyway. But also, really, combine the minimum wage increase with massive public jobs programs. Would Prager U support? Of course they wouldn't, which shows that unemployment has absolutely nothing to do with why they're actually opposed to this. But also, like, okay, the employer offers you a certain, you know, a certain set of job conditions. You're desperate enough to say yes, but then the government makes it illegal. Like, okay, you could be describing child labor laws right now. You could be describing basic workplace safety laws.
I am describing that.
I mean, you say that. I mean, they're the same kind of people who will defend no minimum wage laws are often the kind of people who will write those op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, like, sweatshops are evil, but, you know, ... and then, you know,
it's a little, what's
you know,
little
800
evil
word
between
defense of
friends.
sweatshops, right? So I'm not sure if that would be so convincing to them.
No, but, you know, I do always go back to that Elizabeth Brunig line about how the half the point of a debate is to get the other person to tell you what they really think, right? That they that I think drawing out those consequences could be useful if only to simulate come to Jesus moments among anybody who's on the fence. But in, you know, sexual harassment laws, like, you know, whatever, you could keep going, right? Any kind of law that regulates what happens in the workplace. Like, you know, yeah, there are people who are desperate enough to accept those conditions. The question is, should they have to? But in any case, we should finish out the video.
And that young person loses more than a paycheck. He also loses valuable work experience, learning to accept responsibility, dealing with a boss, getting along with coworkers, all the things that demonstrate to an employer that he made the right choice in hiring, and all the things that will help that young person get a better paying job down the road.
Yes!
A recent study found that in some cities, the unemployment rate for teens without a high school diploma approached 50%. Pricing these teens out of the labor market does them no favors. It's not doing the rest of society any favors either. Teenagers who can't find jobs often find trouble. Advocates of a higher minimum wage argue that while some young people might be priced out of the job market, this is outweighed by the fact that those who have minimum wage jobs will get a wage increase. But that doesn't mean they'd be better off. It's true that the government can force business owners to pay its minimum wage workers more per hour, but it can't force these business owners to pay them more per week. According to the Los Angeles Times, after Connecticut raised its minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, a 20-year-old woman who worked at a donut shop in Hartford was soon disappointed when her hours were cut from 35 per week to 27. Employers will look for other ways to cut costs. The Economic Policy Institute, a union-funded organization that pushes for higher minimum wages, admits this. Employers, they write on their website, may be able to absorb some of the costs of a wage increase through higher productivity, lower recruiting and training costs, decreased absenteeism, and increased worker morale. How would an employer get higher productivity? By working the employees harder. How would an employer cut training costs? By training them less. So let's summarize. Raising the minimum wage makes it harder for young and inexperienced workers to get jobs, to get on that crucial first rung of the employment ladder. And many of those who do benefit from a wage increase will likely find those benefits undone. They will work fewer hours, will work harder per hour, and will get less training. Sounds like the New York Times had it right back in 1987. I'm David Henderson, the editor of the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics for Prager University.
Yeah. Thoughts?
Well, I was thinking. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andrew. Yeah.
No, go right ahead.
No, I was thinking of how much this whole narrative reminded me a bit of Hirschman's favorite typology. I know we discussed this a few weeks back. Because again, a lot of this is based purely on unempirical speculation about what might happen in the event of certain things occurring. And obviously, there's a lot of empirical data.
The economic, I particularly like that the best quote they could come up with that sounded impressive was the Economic Policy Institute saying employers may be able to absorb some of the cost through all of this stuff. And then he's just treating it as, see, it's all going to be, it's definitely all going to be absorbed that way.
No, absolutely. Right. But I think where this gets its power for the political right, at the very least, is in the fact that it has a nice little rhetorical quality to it. Right. The first one about, well, this is going to hurt the people it's intended to actually benefit is very much in line with this kind of perversity thesis that he puts in, that he talks about at great length in the book. Right. That ultimately the left, even though it has good intentions, is going to end up damaging the people that it claims to care so much about. Right. And then the other thing that he brings up there reminded me a lot of the Jeopardy thesis. Right. This idea that, well, you might be working at a job and everything will be going fine, but if you agitate for an increase in minimum wage, yeah, you might get paid more, but that will jeopardize how many hours that you end up working, right? And now none of this is based upon anything that's real or tangible, but it gains a lot of power from the fact that these are nice sounding stories, or at least they're scary sounding stories, right? It's like, oh God, sometimes these inversions can occur. Sometimes pride does come up before the fall, and busybody government officials can actually make things worse when they're trying to make things better, right? And I think what we really need to do on the left is insist that conservatives stop relying on these kind of fairy tale rhetorics and actually show us hard data that demonstrates why it is that these fairy tales have some substance to them. Otherwise, they should stick to making cartoons, because I will say I do enjoy that picture of like these kids are going to get in trouble with the thing on top, right?
Yeah.
It reminded me of those like anti-drug advertisements from the fucking 1990s. Where like, this is your brain on drugs.
Kids who don't find jobs often find trouble.
I like when they drop the just like cool libertarian veneer to go into that 9 o'clock news scare tactics where they're just very brief. They're like trouble. Anyway, back to this super dry objective explanation of what will happen.
Which is also interesting though, because in passing, obviously abstract away the goofy reefer madness ass trouble, right? Abstract away that framing, right?
Baby eating.
And there is actually something that it's weird that Prager U just admitted there, which is, so now you're saying that crime is fueled by economic desperation. That's interesting.
Oh yeah.
Right? Do you still think the best solution is to just lock more people up, or can we have a conversation about that? Right? I mean,
it's not crime, Ben. It's malarkey, right? Malarkey is more ambiguous and more devious than crime.
Yeah. Anyway, but putting that aside, this whole thing about how the best, what do they say, that the government can make employer pay you more per hour, but they can't make you pay more. They pay you more for a week. And it's like, okay, one, obviously to Matt's point about like data, the evidence for that was literally, this one thing happened to one person in Michigan once. I would like to see some better statistical backing for that point. But two, let's assume they're right that thanks to this damn minimum wage, I have lost my job, but I am getting paid the exact same income for working fewer hours a week. That doesn't sound bad to me. I mean, like, obviously I'd prefer to have the raise, but like, it's not obvious to me why I should be afraid of that.
Yeah, but I mean, Ben, if she has too much free time, again, she'll get into trouble.
Trouble. Yeah.
We got to be concerned about that, right? I mean, if people aren't being disciplined and going to work, then who knows what kind of hooliganism they'll get up to.
Yeah, I mean, the point about productivity is definitely right. In fact, if you read like the about chapters 10 through 15 of Capital Volume 1, Marx says the same thing, that you get productivity increases, when people workers can't be squeezed in other ways, because he's talking about the struggle to pass the 10 hours bill in England, and and he says that once there's this legal limit to the number of hours that they can force you, to stay at work to squeeze surplus value out of you that way, then there's this incentive to find ways to sort of increase the amount that can be squeezed out within the workday, which is sometimes bad for reasons hinted at in the video, right? That can mean like cracking the whip harder. Sometimes not necessarily bad, at least in a long-term sense, that like if that leads to like technological innovation, that's that actually, in a better society in the future would be good to have. But also, like, yeah, okay. I mean, point taken that anything that like any kind of limit on their ability to squeeze every drop of blood and profit that they can from the workforce, employers will find creative ways to try to get around. That's certainly true. But I think the best point about this was made in the chat by Jemp, who says, so he's just arguing for unions, right? Like there is a reason why the original slogan was $15 and a union, right? That's like, yeah, you're right. Employers will indeed resort to all sorts of malarkey to avoid having to having to actually give you a better shake, which is why it's good. It's a nice start to have to have the regulatory state doing what it is doing, but there's really no substitute for exercising some actual power at the workplace. So yes, thank you, Prager U.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I'd also like to point out that Nathan Robinson has a really good deconstruction of this exact point and this exact argument in his book, Responding to the Right, which is really good. People should read it. But one of the things that he points out is in videos like this, you see that all the anxiety and all the rhetoric about cuts and kind of desubstantiating workplace provisions and workplace regulations is directed downwards. You very rarely hear these people talk about, well, but my boss is going to have to take a serious pay cut in order to keep this working. And that's a terrible thing because they know perfectly well that A, that's probably not what's going to happen, right? Your boss isn't going to decide to take a pay cut because he has to pay more in minimum wage. He's going to decide to cut your job according to all these models. And B, the moral impetus is that, well, no, I shouldn't have to take a pay cut for these kinds of things, right? Because I earn my money and they're the people who are entitled to that. All the people at the bottom, if they wanted to work for $7 an hour, they were willing to work for $7 an hour, that's how much they should get, right? And any effort to try to pay them more is somehow disrupting the natural order of things, right? And I think what we should be starting to do is, again, redirecting a lot of this up by saying, hey, listen, if they're so concerned about all this, then maybe the CEO of any number of these companies should build less rocket ships, as you put it, and reinvest in their workplace. And that can offset some of the costs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, this is why I think the Mondragon model is an important one to look at because sure, stuff happens. There are external shocks that are going to happen. Definitely if you have any kind of market economy, but regardless, right? Just things happen in the world. But even to the extent that those are unavoidable, which, depends on what kind of shock we're talking about, right? But even to the extent they are, it's not, I mean, Jake was talking earlier about the, he was quoting, I think, Michael Brooks about the naturalizing or mythologizing, contingent social structures. So like, yeah, there's nothing that's like etched into the fabric of reality about what the procedures are for getting to decide how the effects of those shocks are distributed among relevant stakeholders, right? So like, yeah, if you have a traditional capitalist firm where and it's not unionized, so you don't even have like that little bit of worker power. The boss can do whatever the hell they want, and so sure, the effects of the shock are going to be distributed downward. That they're going to go. People are going to lose their jobs, lose their pay. Etc. All that stuff's going to happen, but that's not inevitable. That's not like just baked into the edifice of reality, right? I mean, that's a result of politics, right? That we organize our society that way. We could organize our society in a different way where everybody who was going to be affected voted on how the shocks are distributed. And I think those real world examples like Mondragon show that when that's the case, you have very different results, right? Like when something happens like, COVID-19 or whatever, that like, it's not just inevitable that like, of course, what happens at Walmart is the only thing that could happen, right? And it's like, no, you could, what happens in Mondragon could be the only thing that happened. Also, I did just want to say, Matt, I hesitate here because Matt reads like terrifyingly more than anybody I know. So it's possible that he's read that 1987 New York Times editorial that they were talking about. Okay. In that case, that was a very good guess because you said they had to go back to 1987 to find someone who sort of agrees with them.
Yeah.
I looked up that 1987 New York Times editorial. I think we have a graphic of the editorial itself. And then, yeah, there we go. That's the one they're quoting, right? So it has the headline that they read off there, the right minimum wage, $0.00. Okay. But how much do they agree with Prager U here? Well, the top line is certainly the same. And to be clear, this is not an editorial I like. I think it's actually a pretty dumb editorial in a lot of ways. But I think there's a little bit less agreement with Prager U than the video suggested. I mean, I don't want to impugn the integrity of the educators at Prager University, but if you actually look this up, here's what they say. After going through all of these kinds of neoclassical economic arguments against minimum wage laws, right? Which is like what they do for like the first like half of what you just saw on the screen. They say this: perhaps the mistake here is to accept the limited terms of the debate. The working poor obviously deserve a better shake, but it should not surpass our ingenuity or generosity to help some of them without hurting others. Here are two means towards that end. Wage supplements. Government might subsidize low wages with either cash or payments for medical insurance, pensions, or Social Security taxes. Alternatively, Washington could enlarge the existing earned income tax credit, a negative income tax paying up to $800 a year to working poor families. This would permit better targeting since minimum wage workers and affluent families would not be eligible. Training and education. The alternative to supplementing income for the least skilled workers is to raise their earning power in a free labor market. In the last 2 decades, dozens of programs to do that have produced mixed results at a very high cost, but the concept isn't necessarily at fault. Nurturing the potential of individuals raised in poverty is very difficult. A humane society would learn from its mistakes and keep trying. Okay, so a couple points about this. One, yeah, this is not a good editorial. You can tell that, like, I think if you compare it to probably the kind of shit that the New York Times was printing in its editorial pages, like when LBJ was president, right? Like by 1987, the state of American liberalism was pretty grim, right? A lot of these kinds of neoliberal assumptions were just totally accepted, right? So they're just taking it for granted, for example, that of course the minimum wage raises unemployment and therefore hurts those who it's supposed to help, blah blah blah, right? That's all the stuff we were talking about earlier. Bad assumption. Secondly, they're doing just the classic neoliberal thing at the end with their second suggestion that like training and education will solve poverty, which makes no sense. This is what we were talking about in the philosophy segment last week with Jen. This is the composition fallacy. That's like, yeah, clearly education helps individuals be upwardly mobile, but it can't be a collective solution to poverty, because the only reason that education, training, possession of certain skills or credentials helps people in the labor market is because it's rare, right? This is not some special Marxist or radical socialist insight. This is like what your wildly pro-capitalist Econ 101 textbook said, supply and demand, right? That they work in the labor market like any other market to a certain extent, right? So it's like, yeah, if everybody goes to college, then having a college degree won't actually increase your earning power. That's not how any of that works, right? That's not like if everybody who is and for one thing, like, yeah, I mean, if everybody who's a burger flipper right now, has, learns to code, then that ability won't actually, be able to command a higher salary on, labor market than the ability to flip burgers will. In fact, and in fact, a lot of them will still have to having to flip burgers. And anyway, what's the plan? To just like not have burgers anymore? What's the in that example, right? Or like people picking lettuce, or we're just not going to have lettuce anymore, right? Like, obviously, if they actually believe what they say at the beginning of the paragraph, the working poor deserve a better shake. Well, okay, somebody's going to be doing those jobs, right? Saying we're going to help people be upwardly mobile just doesn't tell you what are you actually going to do to help the people who are still going to have those jobs. So I think that part of it was really dumb. But the first part is interesting, because in the first part, what they're essentially saying is, well, okay, we're willing to accept all of these Prager U-ish economic arguments against raising the minimum wage. So let's just have the government pay some of the wages of these workers. And I don't think Prager U is going to be on board with that. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.